us once more at the new edition of EuropeanChats, where we gather leaders from across the European Movement Network from all over Europe to discuss some of the pressing issues of the day. And with us for this edition, we have two distinguished colleagues from Ireland and the UK, Mike Galsworthy, who is the chair of the European Movement UK, and Noelle O Connell, who is the CEO of European Movement Ireland. And considering where they're coming from, of course, today's discussion will be about UK-EU relations and within the wider context that we're currently experiencing. Mike, Noelle, thank you very much for joining today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Great to join you.
Wonderful. Well, I'll first perhaps start with you, Mike. Over the last couple of years, we've seen a change in the tone of the kind of the narrative that comes out of the UK. Obviously, the new government has contributed quite a lot to that regard. We've seen improvement in relations and quite a lot of significant movement on various areas. How would you assess both the new government's record on relations with the EU, but also the state of that relationship so far?
Right. So I would say that before the new government came in, we actually had, under the Conservative Party, a maximum of the pendulum swing towards trying to pull Britain away from the EU. And you even had a bill in Parliament that was planning to burn all common legislation. But then with Rishi Sunak's deal with the EU, it started solidifying things and rationality started coming back in. And then when the new government came in under Keir Starmer, the plan overtly was to get closer to Europe, but outside, staying outside still, the three red lines for them of customs union, free movement, and single market. Immediately when the new government came in, David Lammy, the foreign secretary, was across Europe meeting people, and the tone changed. But then there was a period where it seemed stuck, as in the new government didn't know what to do next. And the Europeans were getting quite frustrated and saying, okay, this sounded like it was going to be a change in mood music, but what are you proposing? And the government kind of got stuck on saying, we're not going to cross the three red lines. Okay, yeah, fine, but what are you proposing? And this went on for a while until we got to the UK-EU summit of May 19th this year, when there was quite a package of proposals put out as to how the UK and EU were going to start working together. And this was a package of measures to be sort of done over the next year, and then there'll be another summit, and then the year after that another summit. So in that package, the first big framing was meant to be the defence stuff. If you look at polling in the UK, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, there's common agreement that this is our shared continent, it's under threat from Russia, Trump's looking a bit dodgy, and working on defence together is a natural fit. The other elements of the summit were the youth mobility scheme. This is something that the EU has never done before with a single country, to actually have a mobility scheme with a single country. But the UK had been hesitant on it, partly because of the narrative of immigration and not wanting to go back to free movement. But also, it's clearly advantageous to our economy and to our sort of shared culture and cooperation. So that one was put on the table, as well as lowering trade barriers between the EU and the UK, which mainly revolved around the food, the sanitary and phytosanitary checks associated with all the red tape of just being able to send each other a lot of those basic goods. So it was a good start. That was the first time in which there was real movement of working together. And I have to say that since then, because there wasn't so much pushback from the tabloid press in the UK that's very Brexity. There was some squealing at the time, but it really didn't cut through deeply. I think the government feels more comfortable now with having these joint agreements with France or with Germany in order to actually start building closer. They still have their three red lines, which gets in the way of better economic development and more capacity, but nevertheless, you can see the direction of travel. You know that that's what's wanted by the populace at large in the UK, and it feels as though we're moving now. We're moving into a position that it feels more like we're working with the team of Europe.
That's very interesting indeed. And obviously, external factors have played a role, and we're going to come back both on the Trump effect, but also, of course, the wider security situation in Europe. But Noel, perhaps I'll come to you now, and from both an Irish perspective, but also from an EU perspective, what do you think is the attitude of European leaders at large towards this change in narrative and this reapproachment, let's say, that the Labour government has pursued since coming in office?
Yeah, no, thanks, Petros, and really interesting to get Mike's perspective on it as well. Obviously, from the Irish viewpoint, it's very welcome that reset. You can see that there is a cooling and a dialing down in terms of temperature and friction, which is really, really welcome. And that has percolated across not only in terms of the British-Irish relations, but more broadly, I think across the EU. There's a real momentum and a sense that we have gone from the frosty temperature to a more shared and committed momentum and a desire genuinely to work together to find solutions.
Was that a deliberate pun, Noelle, about frosty?
Absolutely, absolutely not. Puns, no puns. And look, we're in Dublin, and the temperature's always colder here than than where you guys are. But no, we're just glad that the mood music is better, Mike. Right? Well, I'll go with that. It's definitely that the common understanding, I suppose, has kind of provided a vision and a framework for some forward-looking developments, as Mike mentioned, in terms of the youth mobility. But not only that, we've seen it with energy, cooperation, security and defence, and also, attempts towards securing an SPS agreement between the EU and Britain. And that would really have a positive knock-on impact for us on the island of Ireland through that interplay of the Windsor framework. And what's going to be interesting from an Irish perspective, I suppose, as well, is that the Trade and Cooperation Agreement review is scheduled to begin in May of next year, which is just a couple of months before Ireland assumes the rotating presidency of the EU for the eighth time, and it's going to be very bittersweet, if I can be honest, and say that for the first time Ireland will be holding the presidency, and Northern Ireland is the UK isn't there. UK, Ireland, Denmark, we all joined at the same time, and just the presidency. I think it'll be really important next year from an Irish perspective that we don't forget about the North, and wider EU-British relations are really, really important. And I think arguably the reset needs to be continually nurtured to ensure that reset continues.
Indeed. I mean, it's obviously very encouraging to see these steps, but and to a large extent, of course, public opinion is responsible for it. We've seen a shift in favor of rejoining the EU. The percentages, of course, vary depending on how the question is asked, but in general, people seem to be much more in favor of closer relations with the EU, that's for sure. And a large percentage also are toying with the idea of rejoining the EU. And that in itself, I think, is a contributing factor to this change. But as we mentioned, and Mike already have flagged this, external factors play a role here too. And perhaps I'd like to turn our attention now to our friends across the Atlantic, or what used to be our friends across the Atlantic, and of course the current president, Donald Trump, and his approach towards alliances in general, treating everyone as a potential enemy, but in particular, especially when it comes to trade. We have seen a much more confrontational approach to trade relations, a zero-sum game. If they gain, we lose, and as a result, a change of tone in the contact. Now, the UK has been perhaps spared a lot of the grievances that Mr. Trump has for most of the world. He speaks very warmly of Britain, even of Prime Minister Starmer. And I think at some point in a recent interview with the BBC, he said, even though he's a liberal, I like him, which probably is an interesting way to frame it. But certainly, we've seen that the UK has been one of the first countries that signed a trade deal, whereas the EU is still in the process of negotiating one. Now, it would be interesting to hear, first of all, how do you think all this, Trump's return to the White Office, is impacting EU-UK relations? And perhaps if there is scope for the two to work together in dealing with Trump, or if in a desperate effort to be on the good books of him, we might see a break in that relationship. Mike, if you want, please go first.
Well, that's a big question, and it gets straight to the heart of where global dynamics are shifting hugely at the moment. So the three big powers and markets in the world are Europe, the States, and China. And then there's also secondarily, Russia, and then India and Brazil sort of coming through. America's lead in the world is already looking to be on slippery slopes, and Donald Trump has just made it a lot more unstable and fractious. Now, that doesn't mean that America's going to fall overnight and we should ignore America outright, but it does mean, and everyone can feel, the dynamics changing. Europe has to step up for itself on the defense front, but also in terms of its trade networks for its own stability. And that makes for some conflictual dynamics between Europe as a whole and the States, seen in not just Ukraine, or not just Ukraine and Gaza, Israel, but also in terms of trade, and also in terms of what kind of relationships we're allowed to have with China and other players. So there's a lot in the mix here. And the UK is kind of caught in the middle, like we all knew that it would be. We've sort of taken a step out of the team, and we're less powerful like that, but do we really want to go sucking up to the United States when Donald Trump's loyalties don't seem that robust? If you look at the British population as a whole, Trump is hugely disliked, even into the right-wing parties. So there's not a lot of love for Donald Trump's America. However, I think there is appreciation that Keir Starmer needs to keep a hand in there, and probably has a better opportunity to keep a hand in there than does Europe as a whole, because Europe as a whole threatens Trump more, and Trump can be sucked up to. And the UK doesn't have much leverage on the States, not like the EU. The EU can put pressure on the States with its trade dynamics. The UK can't. But if the UK sucks up a little bit, it can save itself and make the Donald Trump look a little bit better because it's making his deals. So it was a pragmatic move on Keir Starmer's part to get close. It also means that he retains his ear a little bit for what it's worth. But the mood music let's go with that phrase, in the UK as a whole, polling will show you repeatedly is much more towards we like the values of Europe more than we like the values of the States in terms of basic human rights, in terms of prioritizing Ukraine, in terms of how you tackle climate issues, in terms of what democracy should look and feel like, what consumer protections are, how you invest in your public at large, all of that. So the UK, I think, is moving towards Europe more than the States, quite clearly, but it does make a lot of sense for the UK to keep a hand in with the States, mainly not to antagonize, but perhaps to have a little bit of influence. But let's be real here. Donald Trump is going to do what Donald Trump wants to do, and a little bit of flattery will get you so far, but not much beyond that. And that's the real politic of the situation here.
Indeed. And, Noel, in the EU, of course, there is intense debate about how to handle Trump. And we've seen various people travel over to Washington and sit down with him in the White House and apply different techniques, perhaps, in an effort to, tickle him that way and caress him that the other way, just to make sure that, they get a response. And of course, there is discussion within the EU institutions, and some are arguing that we should be hard, utilize the leverage that our size, the EU size, offer us, and push back on some of his trade threats. And others are suggesting that perhaps it's better not to engage in full frontal confrontation with someone that, as Mike said, is unpredictable, to put it mildly. How do you view, Noel, that balancing act that the EU is trying to achieve, and especially keeping an eye at what our next door neighbors in Britain are doing?
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it, to think that we're 6 months to the day or two after into this second Trump administration, and it's fair to say there's no evidence, there's no sign of a slowdown in news from the White House. I think we're living through times that are less of a news cycle and more of a news tour de Trump at the moment. So, and what we are seeing really, I think, play out.
News cyclone, I think.
Sorry?
New cyclone, yeah.
It's not a new cycle anymore, it's a new cyclone.
Very good.
That's why I call
it. What's more disastrous and pronounced than a cyclone? We're really going into our meteorological metaphors here, but that is what it's like, and we're seeing that evolution of a commitment to a rules-based multilateral global trading order. We're going from free trade to fee trade from an American perspective, with tariffs really being viewed as a corrective, punitive measure. And then how does this impact more broadly on the EU, and how does the EU deal with this? As you said, Petros, what we're seeing is a determination and a resolve, I think, from an EU perspective to remain unified, to respond rather than react, to stay calm and carry on, continue negotiating. We know Commissioner Šefčovič and his team are over there. But how do you deal with an administration and get consistency, get a framework agreement that works to the benefit of all of the EU citizens? Like, let's not forget, as Mike said, we're talking about a single market of 450 million consumers. So we do have leverage, and I think that has to be brought to bear in a reasoned, measured approach, but robust enough that defends and upholds both the values and the interests and safeguards the interests of the EU. So I think getting and navigating that balance is very tricky, and keeping those lines of dialogue and communication open. But we have to remember as well, I mean, President Trump, stated, I think not too long ago, that the EU was founded, and forgive me for using a rude word, but was founded to screw the US, which is so blatantly not true, and is false. So these are certainly challenges that I think underpin and frame the discussions that are ongoing. But we have to ensure that that the EU obviously still is a really important trade partner for the UK, for the US as well, and getting a negotiated framework settlement that lowers the temperature, that reduces volatility and uncertainty, I think is the least worst outcome. But again, there are no winners in this tariff war, sadly.
Well, yes, indeed. And obviously, that's why I think all level-headed sides are trying to find a negotiated settlement of one way or the other. And from what I read, we're moving towards perhaps a 15% tariff deal for the EU with the US, but there is obviously a lot. Yes, Mike.
I was going to say, because Noelle also
Please go ahead, Mike.
there are no winners in this tariff battle. Economically, no, but in terms of shifting power and in terms of the eyes of the rest of the world, they see Donald Trump as mad. They want to know who that shares their values can actually stand up to him. So I think the EU is actually realizing that it is a sleeping giant that needs to wake up, that needs to step up to the plate, because like I said before, the three big powers have been the United States, Europe, and China, and everything has been led by the United States to date. In a lot of international frameworks, China is starting to come to the fore, but it is an aggressive single party state. And so lots of the rest of the world are looking to Europe to actually say, it's okay, we can take this on. We are not going to be broken by Donald Trump's demands. We are strong enough to step into a global leadership position on everything that matters in terms of climate change, keeping trade stable, the international standards and norms, whether it be the United Nations and all the structures of the United Nations that America is now panning or leaving, the International Criminal Court, all of these fundamental structures set up predominantly at the end of World War II in order to guarantee stability and peace and fundamental human rights and respect and things like that. That whole framework, Europe is now kind of seen by the rest of the world as being at the head of it. And so Europe actually needs to prove itself to be strong, whether Trump decides to pull out or even go for Europe or any rivals. And that works from across Ukraine to all those other issues that I just mentioned. And so it's actually imperative for Europe to be the EU to be robust in the face of this.
I think that's a really good point, Mike. Exactly, and what we need now to see is that will and that resolve and that determination for the EU to fully embrace the leadership mantle that it has, and the opportunity as well, and the responsibility, I think, at a global level, because what we are seeing as well, that the EU is is trusted, its long-standing commitment to multilateral world order, to rules-based, and trying not to go with a lose-lose scenario. So I think it is going to be incumbent upon the EU to demonstrate that leadership. And look, it's done it before. Petros, you and I have had many conversations, but in terms of what we've seen in terms of the time of how it managed to pivot and deal with the COVID pandemic and the funding supports the financial crisis, Brexit. There are so many global challenges and issues, and the EU taking on board its leadership potential and actually delivering, I think, is something that we want to see, we hope to see, but we really, really need it to deliver and stand up and be counted.
I think it's important for the future of humanity. I will put it in those terms, quite bluntly, as a model for how humans should conduct their affairs on this small mote of dust that is the Earth. It has to be collaborative, international, respectful, and based on that well-balanced plurality. And I think the more that the UK and Canada in particular can show that they're working within and bolted on to the European framework and the European way of doing things, the more that kind of shores that up. There's one thing that I think that the EU and Europe as a whole really needs to get its skates on with, though, in order to really show leadership, and that's actually the situation in Gaza, because obviously the States isn't going to do anything there. And the EU is Israel's biggest trading partner, and it does have leverage there. And if it is to convince the rest of the world that it is stepping into leadership dynamics, I think in the eyes of the rest of the world, that is a core one where the EU as a body and Europe as a whole really needs to make moves urgently.
Couldn't agree more.
Indeed, and that actually is a good pivot for us to look a little bit at the security and defense situation in our continent, and how, yes, both the war in Ukraine since Russia's full-scale invasion, but also other geopolitical challenges, and that includes, of course, yes, the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, but also mass population movement, and of course the threat from the Far East, and that includes China. How all these things are also shaping a little bit the European defense and security landscape. And I say European because I think this is one area where the UK should and is fully aligned and perhaps even integrated with Europe. So yeah, maybe I can start with you, Noel, this time, and see, comment a little bit on efforts by the European Union to, have some sort of movement, concerted movement towards closer European defense security. How do you see those attempts?
Yeah, I think there has been a united front, and in terms of joint efforts to obviously support Ukraine, and I think credit to the UK, it's really been to the fore in that, and what is really welcome now is that the geographical reality of the UK and the EU being indivisible and security being inextricably linked post-Brexit. So, the UK has left the EU, but geographically it is still very, very much in Europe, and that renewed agenda is really welcome. We saw only recently the EU's chief diplomat, Kaja Kallas, traveling to London for those continual talks in terms of the coordination of defensive initiatives vis-a-vis Russia, and obviously security and defense featuring really strongly at the EU-UK summit, and framing that cooperation in areas such as, whether that's the regional security, whether that's maritime, space, hybrid, FIMI, the list goes on. And now getting, conversations now taking place in terms of the UK possibly accessing the EU's safe defence fund and that joint procurement. So I think what we've seen, Petros, in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, developments in the US, they may have been somewhat of the catalyst in terms of this area of cooperation. But I suppose the devil really is going to be in the details. So how will all that play out? But if I'm going to continue with my quotes and my analogies and my metaphors, I'm now going into the marine area, if I can. So Mike, especially for you. But I think was it Pedro Serrano, the EU ambassador to the UK? He put it recently at one of the trade and cooperation domestic advisory group meetings that we sit on here in European Movement Ireland. But he says that the EU needs to become a porcupine in terms of defence and security, and as such, the UK needs to be one of its spines. So I like that. I think that's a good way to I suppose look forward and keep the momentum and the relationship and the reality going, notwithstanding that there will be some tricky challenges around it.
Mike?
The defense and security aspect is vital, and it does really unite Europe as a whole. You know, on that fundamental, visceral level of defense of, you know, territory and everything that you hold dear, your communities. And I think actually, since there was a financial crisis in 2008, and you know, European countries were at sixes and sevens then. You know, you had your Euro crisis, you had the PIGS countries that were really suffering, and there was a sense of everything sort of falling apart, and part of that was Brexit. But I think the test of Brexit, followed by the test of COVID, and then followed by the test of the Russian invasion, has really united a common European purpose and reminded people that team play is essential in order to keep things together and keep things secure. And with actual European defence capacity, we've known for a long time that it's fairly inadequate, but you know, you hit the snooze button on the clock again and again and again until someone like Donald Trump comes along and actually rips the duvet off. And then you feel the cold chill, and then you get up, you make a cup of coffee, and you go, right, what's the time? Oh my God, there's a lot to do. And I think we're at that stage now where we've just necked back the coffee and realized, okay, right, systems integration, cybersecurity, satellites, information, ammunition production, interoperability of resources, and all of that is go, go, go at the moment, because we understood with Trump's flakiness about Ukraine that guarantee of the states is no longer there. That was exacerbated by his threats to Greenland. And then it was also exacerbated by his comment that, you know, the F-35 should have a kill switch and I should have access to it in the White House so we can make planes drop out of the sky if we're no longer friendly with Europe, right? You can't rely on that. So I think that the new surge of investment of the European countries, you know, in their budgets is not a win for Donald Trump and NATO, because we're already looking away from American structures. That investment is in our own systems, our own reimagining of our manufacturing capabilities. I would say we, because this is right across Europe now, our cybersecurity, our intelligence sharing, everything that we need to fill in to be a self-standing porcupine. And I think that this has also got an opportunity to be a real renaissance for Europe as well. Because with that big investment in defense, you've seen it in America, investment in defense gets through to innovation everywhere. At the same time, we've got a great science program, and there is flight from the United States of top academics, and there's certain brain diversion from around the world, and Europe's already realizing that it can capitalize on it. I think that there's a really solid future there. Now, add in shifting trade dynamics, and if you get Canada working more closely with Europe, if you get Iceland becoming a full EU member, and you're thinking about the Arctic passages for trade and defense, then I think in all of this, Europe has phenomenal capacity to step up. Particularly if Ukraine and Georgia were to join the EU as well, your links with the rest of the world and European capacity to really hold and guard its own would be phenomenally enhanced. So I do think that, painful as it can be to other parts of the budget at the moment, Europe investing in defense and doing it in a well-coordinated and interoperable way is actually foundational to European freedom just as much as energy independence is and food independence is. And I think once we've got those three nailed, then Europe will actually have the capacity to do bold things and strong things in the interests of Europe and its fundamental principles about humanity without being held hostage by the Middle East or Russia or America as it has done before. So I think vital moves are being made now, and security is fundamental to it.
Indeed, that's quite true, actually. And of course, we have seen some movements in that direction, but all of them are a little bit disjointed, perhaps not as ambitious as both you, Mike, and Noelle mentioned earlier. And of course, there is also the big question mark around the institutional makeup of the EU, of this enlarged EU, one that indeed stretches from the north of the Atlantic all the way into the Caucasus countries. And how can we make that EU able to take decisions, the very important decisions, in an efficient and effective way, considering the challenges that we are facing? And I think that's also an aspect that we need to consider when we are redesigning the security and defense architecture across our continent and enlarging the European Union to address some of those challenges. But of course, I agree with both of you that both what's happening in the US and Russia's focusing very much the attention of European leaders, perhaps not as much as we would like to see as advocates of closer European cooperation, but certainly much more than we thought would be possible just a couple of years ago.
Yeah. Absolutely. And Petros, I might just jump in there, Petros, if I can, and interesting, I suppose to maybe to conclude on a couple of points, on what people should keep an eye out for as the evolving EU-UK relationship develops, and also from an EU perspective. I mean, I think only today we saw that the EU agreeing countermeasures coming into play of countermeasures of about 93 billion if a deal isn't agreed between the EU and the US on the 7th of August. And I think that's going to be one to watch in terms of if the EU and the UK end up having very different relationships with America, and how the tariffs coming into play from an EU-UK perspective, how will that impact EU-UK relations as well, as President Trump heads to Scotland, I think, Mike, for a couple of rounds on his golf courses, and then I think he's got a state visit with the King in September. So it's certainly not going to be a quiet August. I fear, but I hope.
I think when Trump comes across, it will be very clear to the rest of the world what a lot of Brits think about Trump, and that actually might be quite a unifying moment with European colleagues.
Interesting. That's certainly one to watch, and perhaps what better way to end our conversation. Thank you both very much. This was extremely insightful and a worthy addition to a long series of conversations with civil society leaders from across the continent. To all those of you watching, I'd like to thank you for joining. Thank Mike and Noelle once more for the great insights and analysis, and we look forward to having you with us in the next edition of this online series of events. Thanks again, and see you soon.